I'll tell you a little story to start with. My mother-in-law, who's gone now, was an artist. And when she was about 85, and by the way, she lived till she was, I think, 93. When she was 85, she said to me, I feel like a 25-year-old girl trapped in an 85-year-old body. And I can totally relate to that. I have had such a long, amazing, creative life. And sometimes I just think, man, how did I do all that? And then I remember it's like, oh, I'm a senior now. I just turned 66. And of course, those other ages are right around the corner too. So it's a good time to look back and appreciate and enjoy all of the chapters, all of the pages. And it's a lot of fun to share with somebody else. So I thank all of you who showed up and who are watching the recording. Well, this is me at maybe the age of 3 or 4, something like that. It's kind of funny. I don't think of myself as a sassy person, but that's definitely a sassy photo. And I can see little glimmers of who I was to become in this with the glasses and the rompers and of course my red tricycle. But this was my mom, and remember this picture for later. Because we have a love of horses that runs in the family. And I pretty much look like my mom when I was her age, the same as this. So we're a family of photographers. This is a picture that her dad, my grandpa, took of her, and that's been a big part of my journey as well. Well, I thought you'd get a kick out of this. So I was probably 9 or 10 years old here, fifth grade class. So I lived in California when I was a kid, and we moved to Colorado when I was 10 years old. And can you spot me in that class? Here, I'll zoom in and show you. I was a very shy little girl. I was like painfully shy. I would turn bright red and stutter if the teacher called on me. I never raised my hand. But I love to draw, so that's pretty much what I would do. Sit in the back and just draw in the margins of my math pages or whatever all day long. But I really, I was interested in fashion and color from a young age, and my options were extremely limited. So when we moved to Longmont, there were 25,000 people who lived there. So, consider I think I got this outfit for Easter Sunday at J.C. Penney. And I knew that you were supposed to have a hat on Easter, but this is the best thing I could come up with that would go with the yellow dress. So, and those are probably the only shoes that I had that would go with that dress. But there you have it. My mom, like me, had really long hair and she liked to wear big prints. And I forgot that until I looked at some photos of her. But, this is just after we had moved from California to Colorado. And, you can see some of that style that came from my mom. Interesting. So when I had a career as a fashion designer, which we'll get to, but I also designed in the early days of textile design in our industry. There are a lot of things that I designed that nobody else had designed, and they've been knocked off a million times since then. But these were some really early things that I designed for Robert Kaufman, and they were inspired by my childhood. So my grandma sewed. Here's I think a first grade picture of it in a dress that she had made with a little lace collar. And I don't think I was particularly thrilled about the dresses she made for me because I was imagining something much more stylish and you know, it was the 60s after all. Um, but nevertheless, I was exposed to this concept of sewing and making your own clothes at a very young age. And so at the age of 10, I also joined 4-H, and a friend of mine taught me how to sew a dress. So that was my introduction to garment sewing in person. Do you remember these patterns?
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh, I would go, to, I forget what store it was, but I'd go to the store and I would just go through the patterns and I'd look at the fabrics and I'd imagine, well, what would this look like in that fabric? So first I was sewing doll clothes and by hand, and then I finally started to sew my own clothes on a machine. I don't remember where I got my first machine, but somewhere along the way I did get a machine. So
Oh, yeah.
this was a first outfit that I made with the help of my grandmother, who was a garment sewer. Both of my grandmothers were very creative and made things, but this was my dad's mom. I went and spent a couple weeks with her, and we went and picked out the fabric, and she sewed this tailored jacket and halter and fitted hip hugger pants. And I thought I was just so cool with the small seersucker red gingham and then the matching larger scale plaid. I was probably, I don't know, 13 there, something like that. But, these were the kind of things that were in the magazines at the time and the kind of illustrations and so on that I was looking at.
Yeah.
And then one day I was wandering around the public library, which was one of my favorite places. Again, it's in a small town. And I stumbled across Vogue magazine, and this was like an epiphany for me because I cared about fashion. I cared about the clothes I wore. Not that we could afford to buy the things that I really wanted, but I started going through those magazines just like a thirsty person coming out of the desert. And I was still drawing, and I was in an art class, and my teacher, who ended up being a mentor, suggested that I get a set of paints. So I actually got a set of oil paints.
Hmm.
And I remember I was so excited because it was about that time that I got a copy of The Agony and the Ecstasy. Remember that book
Yeah.
about Michelangelo? And I read that thing so many times that the cover fell off and the book just basically fell apart. Um, but I started to really get serious about studying art and thinking about, well, maybe I could be an artist someday. So 68. So I was 10 years old here. So these are some drawings of horses in fifth grade. That was my favorite subject at the time. And I actually ended up having a horse of my own. So there's that picture of my mom on the left. That's me on the right and my horse. And I actually went into 4-H with my horse and I competed in barrel racing and had a great time with that for a few years until my family decided we couldn't afford the horse anymore, which was very sad. So you may be picking up a theme here about things I wanted to do that we couldn't afford. So I was starting to get the picture that if I wanted to do this list of things that I was interested in, like traveling to Italy or having a horse or being able to buy clothes, that I would have to make that money for myself. So that's when I started thinking about having a career. And what would that be? So here are some of the horse fabrics that I designed, again, very early on. The one on the left is from a vintage cowgirl collection that I did for Timeless Treasures. That was my very first contract in the industry, in the quilt fabric industry. And then later I did a Chinese collection for Robert Kaufman, and those were the Chinese horses. And this horse, now this has been knocked off a zillion times, but this was actually made into a car commercial that was shown in Japan on TV. And I was contacted by an ad agency in New York, and they said, we'd like to pay you a few $1,000s to license this artwork to be in a car commercial. And I'm like, great. So all of my kids have been exposed to horses. I do not have a horse now, but everybody in our family can ride, and everybody knows how to take care of a horse and saddle a horse and ride a horse. And I've had pets all my life. I'm a real animal lover. These are just some pictures through the years of my pets. And of course, I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian for 35 years, and I live in the tofu capital of the country in Boulder. So, I'm living in a place where it's really easy to be a vegetarian. I'm kind of half vegan, half vegetarian, and my husband is strict vegan. So it's easy to do that when you have a partner who has the same point of view. And some of our other animals that we've had. I don't know if anybody here knows this, but on Facebook, I have a page called Luana's Fabraholic Kitty Club. And it's basically for people who their friends have gotten mad at them because they post so many cat memes and pictures of their cats. It's a place where you can come and post all the cat pictures and cat cartoons and cat videos that you like, and nobody will get mad at you. So here's some more. This is our current crop of pets. So we have three rescue cats and two golden retrievers in the house now. So anyway, that's one chapter. Me and my animals. So I love to put animals and bugs and fish in my fabric collections. This was a breast cancer fundraiser that I did with Kaufman, and I somehow got them to commit to giving 25 cents a yard to breast cancer. Equilter has actually raised over 350,000. We'll talk about that later out of the 2 million we've raised for charity. But this was in addition to that. So I'm always thinking, how can my creative work help other people? Because as artists and designers, we are very powerful. I mean, we have a gift and a talent that not everybody has. And I believe that our talents and gifts should be used for good. And I'll mention later, I did live in Asia for a while, so there's a lot of influence in my textile designs from that time, that part of my life as well. And my in-laws lived in Hawaii, and of course there's a lot of Asian influence in Hawaii as well. For instance, the koi fish actually were taken from a photo that I took at a Buddhist temple in Hawaii. And the cats over there, the yin and yang cats, those were taken from pictures of my cats. So life imitates or life inspires art. So this was my other grandmother. She was a ceramic painter and an embroiderer. And this was actually a gift that I gave to them. I made a watercolor painting of all these things that I was interested in. So you can see there's a horse, there's a cello because I'm a classically trained musician, and art supplies. And so that was the gift that I gave them probably for Christmas or something, and they were showing off their gift. And you can see my grandma managed to put her African violets in the picture too. That was one of her things. And in the cabinet behind her, all the china that she painted. So, and my grandpa here was a photographer as well. So, mentoring is so important. It's important for us to give. And those of us who were lucky enough, we received that when we were young. I've had several mentors in my life. There are three in my young life that were really profoundly influential. And this was my first one. She was my seventh grade art teacher, and I just adored her. I thought she looked like Doris Day. To me, she was like a movie star. In that photo with her, you can see on the left and right are oil paintings that she painted of her children when they were small. Her house was full of antiques from China because her parents were missionaries. And I somehow managed to save this note that she had written to me. Again, she's gone now, but um, I had her as a teacher in seventh grade, and she kind of pulled me out of the class and said, you have talent, and I'd like to help you. And then again, she followed up with me when she was my teacher in high school. So that was Susan Pierpont. I'll always remember her fondly. She was so kind to me when I was going through a difficult time. And let's face it, middle school is a difficult time for everybody, right?
Yep.
It's a terrible time. So she helped me to survive that. And I did play in an orchestra. This was Colorado All-State Orchestra, and I don't know if you can see that underneath the yellow arrow there. I was the second chair cellist when I was, I think, a sophomore or junior in the all-state orchestra. So that was a really big part of my life for many years. So that brings me to my second mentor. So remember, I was this painfully shy little girl. I was again suggested to go and study with this college professor when I was in high school. And so every week, my mother would drive me to Boulder and I would have a private lesson with Dr. Hillegas, who was the head of the string department and the cello professor. And here's the travel part. So Susan Pierpont, she traveled. Well, Dr. Hillegas also traveled, but he would send me postcards from around the world. And I just treasured those so much. And here's one that I managed to save. And so he also had a passion for music and travel and art. And he was just one of those people who was so uh, ebullient, just bubbling over with the joy of life all the time. He would walk up to a grand piano and just start playing like Liberace just for fun. Um, so I was able to take my first overseas trip when I was 15. I was an exchange student in Germany. I had studied German for 1 year in high school. And it's kind of funny, they put me and this other girl with a single father and his 14-year-old son. And she and I had to share a double bed, and to take a bath, we had to go down the basement and put coal in the water heater. So it was quite the adventure for the little girl who hadn't been out of the small town. I remember going past buildings on the train as we went out to the small town Brühl, which is near Cologne, and seeing buildings that were still bombed and bullet holes and things like that from the war. And that affected me very deeply. I just felt like I was visiting there not too long after the war. It was 30 years after the war, but you could still see the effects of the war. And I think that was also the beginning of my awareness or my sensitivity to that topic. But by the way, so this was a dress, a special dress that I designed. That was the first thing that I really designed that I could wear for playing the cello. So you can see it had sort of concentric ruffled layers that got bigger and bigger towards the bottom so I could spread my legs and play the cello. Very practical. So that was, music was a big part of my life, but it certainly wasn't the only part of my life. Um, I I won some awards and I had attention as a musician. I really wanted to go to art school, but my parents got divorced my last year of high school, and I was offered a music scholarship, and so I ended up going to music school for a while. But at the time, I'm a big believer in writing down goals. I do it every year. I write down all the things I want to do. In fact, I have a friend who gives me a really hard time about that. I usually have about 10 things that I want to do, and I get about five of them done. And so I have a friend who always gives me a hard time. And and I said, other people make goals to do two or three things and they get one or two done. I make goal to do 10 things and I get five things done. So to me, that's a good thing because I'm being much more productive by having bigger goals. But you can see, I probably wrote this down when I was 15. I had all these future plans.
Mm.
And it amazes me because I've done all these things. And so that's kind of the punctuation on the end of that story is that, write down your goals because that's just the first step for making them a reality. I made extra money. Oh, playing on soundtracks. In fact, I played on the soundtrack of a Robert Redford movie during that time, and I played a Paco Bell's canon at a lot of weddings in a string quartet, so much that I can't stand that song anymore. But that's how I help to pay the bills. And then I did finally put together a fashion design portfolio, and I was accepted into the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. So I was a performance major at CU Boulder for 2 years, and then I went to the Fashion Institute, which is what I had wanted to do all along. So here's my third and very important mentor. Some of you may even know her. You may have heard of her. So Connie Crawford has been teaching pattern making and also how to make your own dress form. She retired about 5 or 6 years ago due to health issues. She's getting up there in age, but she was my pattern making and draping teacher, and she was the hardest teacher, and everyone hated her. And I was her pet. I got straight A's, and I don't know how I did that, but she arranged for me to have a full scholarship. And so she really, again, I didn't have a lot of money. I was very grateful. I don't even know how I would have finished school without her. So you never know when angels are going to come and sprinkle some fairy dust. And I think she sprinkled the fairy dust with the scholarship committee. She now lives in Washington State. So during the time that I lived in Los Angeles, when in my 20s, I loved to go out dancing. And so that showed up later in one of my collections for Robert Kaufman fabrics. You can see I have two versions of the Disco Witches here. The ones on the left have saggy boobs, and the ones on the right are wearing high-heeled boots, and they're really, sort of 70s Studio 54 disco witches. So I graduated from the Fashion Institute with honors. I was told that I was the only person in my graduating class that actually got a design job straight out of school. I was supposed to work for Bob Mackie, but there was a writer and director strike that year, so that job disappeared. And I ended up getting a job with a silk dress company. And then in addition to designing dresses, I started designing textiles. And at the time, the Fortuny Museum had just opened up in Venice, Italy, and it was in Vogue magazine, and there were books coming out about it, and I was really inspired by that. And just a kind of a cool little connection here. The textile and costume tour that I led to Italy in December, I finally got to go to the Fortuny Museum, and I found the scrap of fabric that had inspired this textile collection back in 1981. So that was a pretty amazing connection that I made last month while I was in Venice. So here's a little blast from the past. Remember the 80s? Remember these personalities who we were seeing on the Vogue covers at that time? That's what was happening. So while I worked for this company, designing silk dresses, I was sent on a trip to Hong Kong. And while I was there, I was offered a job doubling my salary and all expenses paid. And I said yes. And I was 22 years old. I lived there for 3 years. And I visited hundreds of factories during my career when I lived in Hong Kong and when I lived in New York, traveling back to Asia. So on the left, this is a picture of me visiting a kind of a party for an opening of a factory in Hong Kong. And on the right, this was my roommate and my friend. She was Oscar de la Renta's head pattern maker, and I'm still friends with her. She lives in Sarasota, Florida. And oh my goodness, she has the most amazing textile collection. She's been collecting textiles from all over Asia her entire life. But she was also the head pattern maker for Halston in the 70s. So, those runway shows that he was doing in New York, she was the head pattern maker, and she worked for Adrian Christian Dior. So she was a European trained couture pattern maker. And I'll tell you, both Connie Crawford and this friend, Nicole, they both had Bernina sewing machines and they wouldn't let me touch them. So later when I became a Bernina ambassador and had my first Bernina, it was like, oh, finally got a fantastic machine. During those years, I also studied Cantonese. I've studied six languages formally in my life. There really isn't much room left in my head or in that part of my brain for languages, so I just try to brush up on them when I travel these days. But that, again, you can see one of my fabric designs that came from that part of my life. So this is a picture of my Cantonese teachers and their family. I would go to their home once a week and I would take private Cantonese lessons. And then on the left is a fabric that I designed, inspired by that time in my life. So while I lived in Hong Kong, I teamed up with a couple Chinese sisters who owned a boutique and a factory. And they offered to have me do my own collection under my name to be sold exclusively in their boutique. And so there's a picture of me at the opening party at the boutique. On the bottom right is just one of the pictures that I have in my file of one of my silk dresses that I designed, and a magazine carried that photo. And on the left is a textile design that I did for Kaufman, again, that was inspired by the years that I lived in Asia. And so this is my sample making team in the factory. On the right is the wedding gown that was at the end of the fashion show. And you can see me cutting the celebratory cake there on the left. And the one of the sisters is there on the bottom. So that was a pretty sweet time in my life. I was like 25. I was a freelance import designer. I was traveling all over Asia and to New York and Europe. And a lot of times I was the designer behind a licensed name. So there's a postcard from one of my runway shows in 1983. On the right side is a sweater collection that I was doing for a company, for a factory and their customers out of Korea. And I'll just show you some of the technical drawings that I was doing for garments in those days. So these are things that I was drawing. I would first do an illustration and then I would do a technical drawing. And then I would have to put in all of the dimensions, the specs, the colorways, and things like that. Let's see. So then after 3 years, I moved to New York and I started traveling to Asia as an import designer. And I would live in a hotel for about a month while I was working in a factory developing a collection. And you can see at the bottom there, that's the list of all the countries that I was traveling to and working in. So as a young single person, that was a great lifestyle.
Recording in progress.
One of the last trips that I took was in Sri Lanka in 1987. And here are some pictures of me in the sample room developing patterns and samples for production. And I was there for 5 weeks. And it was probably the most exotic place that I had traveled as an import designer. You see that elephant in the back there? That poor guy was chained up by one foot. I was so disturbed by that. But what I didn't know is that 1 week before I flew into Sri Lanka, the flight that I was on had been blown up, and it turned out that it was the beginning of their civil war. And I stayed at this hotel, which originally was the governor's mansion, then it was expanded into a hotel on the shore. And anyway, every day they would come and pick me up in a Bentley and take me to the factory. I had several trips to Taipei, Taiwan. And if you ever get to go to Taiwan, you definitely want to visit the National Art Gallery. Uh, I really think that this is the main reason that China wants to take back Taiwan because Chiang Kai-shek took all of the art treasures from Beijing and from the Forbidden City when he fled to Taiwan, and they dug a tunnel into the mountain, and they keep all of the artwork kind of hidden in that tunnel. And they show some, less than 5% of the collection in the museum at any time. So when I wasn't in Asia, I was in New York, being a 20-something fashion designer. And I had a roommate who was also in the fashion industry. So we had fun dressing up and going out and going to parties and things like that. And in '88, I went to Brazil for a month. And before I left, I took a crash course in Portuguese for 12 weeks. And at the last lesson, our teacher begged us not to go because he was afraid we were going to get mugged. But we knew what to do. We dressed kind of in rags and we didn't wear a watch or any jewelry, and we just kind of looked like really poor students. And in retrospect, we knew a lot of people who were going to Brazil at that time. There was a lot of unrest and economic stress that was going on at that time. And we were the only people we knew who had gone to Brazil and not gotten mugged. So that was something to be proud of, I suppose. And at that time, there was a short period of time where I left the garment industry and I had a bookstore and I was also designing jewelry. So I went there with $10,000 sewed into the waistband of my jeans, and we were purchasing gemstones for my jewelry design business. In 1990, I moved back to Boulder and I started seriously studying painting. I was very interested in being a fine artist. And so I studied classical oil portraiture during that time and also plein air painting, which is painting outside. And I also attended a weekly figure painting group with a live model for 15 years. But then one day, here I was, I had left the garment industry. I really wanted to do something with fabric, with design, with sewing, with color and art. I went into the King Soopers grocery store and I saw something that I'd never noticed before. It was all these quilt magazines. And I picked up Quilter's newsletter and I started paging through, and like the hair on the back of my neck just stood up. And I thought, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. And I never could have guessed that I would end up becoming friends with the editors because these magazines were all being published just down the road in Golden, Colorado. And so Quilter's newsletter does not exist anymore, but the other magazines like McCall's and Fons and Porter and Quiltmaker, those are still being published, and they're being published still just down the road in Golden, Colorado. So I've had a relationship with many editors because many of them have retired at this point. Uh, the third from the left in the turquoise, that's Mary Austin. She was the editor of Quilter's newsletter, gosh, I think for 30 some years. Her mother, Bonnie Lehman, was the founder of Quilter's newsletter. So, I met my husband, who ended up also being my business partner through the Boulder Daily Camera newspaper ads back in 94. We got married in 95. And a couple years later, a few years later in 99, we started this business. The very first quilt market that I went to was in March 1999. We started in the basement of our house. I thought it was going to be a little part-time thing that I could do and stay home with the kids. But in 60 days, we exceeded our 3-year business plan. And the reason for that was because I had gone to about 40 quilt shops over maybe 5 years since I saw that quilter's newsletter on the rack in the grocery store. And whenever I went into a quilt shop, now remember this is the 90s, I would see things like thimbleberries, and all these sort of brown reproduction, really dark prints. And the stores would have maybe one or two things that I was interested in. And I finally realized there is a niche that is not being served in the industry for big, bold, bright prints, for bright batiks, for Asian fabrics. So that's what we decided to start off with, and the business just took off like crazy. On 9/11, I came up with this idea that we would start giving a percentage of sales to charity, and also that we would coordinate to get donated comfort quilts to people who had lost family members in 9/11. So these are some of we always take group photos to kind of document the batches of quilts that came in. I also started designing at this time for Timeless Treasures. So this is one that was, this was with a local artist. I designed and she did the artwork, but it was produced by Timeless Treasures. This was kind of a King Arthur Celtic theme. And then here's that vintage cowgirl, the one that was inspired by my mom and her pony. This was also for Timeless Treasures. And here's my very first quilt that I made that was published in a magazine from that vintage cowgirl quilt collection. In the very, very center of this quilt, you can see that picture of my mom on her pony. And that, of course, is a very precious quilt in my personal collection now. Because I've spent really most of my life in the West, Western themes are really of great interest to me. I love the Southwest. And so this was Enchanted Desert was the name of this collection that I also did for Kaufman. So that cow skull print on the right, I think that's been knocked off by 5 different companies. But I know for sure that I was the first one to do it because I was looking for it and nobody ever had it. I don't think I've mentioned this, but as the head buyer for Equilter over the last 25 years, I figure I look at about 150,000 designs every year, and I would pick about 12 to 14,000 of them. So I literally saw everything that was out there every year, year after year, season after season. And this is part of that Southwest group. This was inspired by a trip to Santa Fe. And this was, I think, the top selling design that I ever did. And of course, this has been, I say knocked off. In the fashion and design business, everything you do, if it's good, is going to be knocked off. And that's just one of the things you have to accept, whether you like it or not. So this has been done by other companies and other designers several times since I originally did it. It's a long, long time ago. But this was inspired by the Guadalupe and the little old church in downtown Santa Fe. And then on the right is the quilt that was made, and that was in McCall's magazine. There was a period of time where I was designing and making a lot of quilts for magazines. So these are some that I did from Hand Eyes. And again, Southwest inspired. Uh, this was an idea that I came up with that has been copied. I'm sure nobody remembers that I did it first. It doesn't really matter at this point, but this idea of a ongoing yardage, selvage to selvage. So the sky at the top is one selvage, the coral reef at the bottom is another selvage, and then it just repeats and goes on and on. So that was inspired by all of our trips to Hawaii to see the in-laws. And here's my son Sam, who's turning 28 next week, in one of his, I'm sure he hated me for it as he got older, but I would always buy him one of these little Hawaiian print outfits with the matching shirt and shorts because I thought they were so cute. And I would come home and think, I should design some fabric like that. So I did. So this was the quilt that was made from that collection that was also in McCall's magazine. It's a big quilt, you can imagine. So it's 44 inches high. Remember in the beginning, I showed you those pictures of the retro cakes? So that was from this retro desserts collection that I did for Robert Kaufman. And that was another quilt that was in, I think, McCall's magazine. Do you remember a long time ago there was an Irish quilt magazine? So I was asked to make this quilt on the left for the first Christmas issue of the Irish Quilt magazine. And then on the right is a quilt that was made from that Camelot King Arthur collection. I also, I bet you didn't know this, I'm an astrologer. Um, Before I got into this industry, I had done over 10,000 readings. And so I convinced the editor of McCall's that I should write some astrology articles. And I did some really fun astrology articles about, so what's an Aries quilter like? What's a Libra quilter like, or having to do with quilt guilds and astrology and things like that. So that was kind of a hoot. And again, this is quite a while ago, but I designed two groups of variegated threads for Eye threads. I actually went to the factory, and each of the color combinations of these variegated threads was inspired by a city that I had visited in my travels around the world. So, big event in our life was adopting a baby from China. And Sophie was born in June of 22, and we adopted her. I went to China in April of 23. So this was a picture they sent to us when she was 4 months old, and we adopted her when she was 8 months old. And there's Sam, my little guy Sam, saying, "Look, this is my new baby sister." So that was just a huge deal in our life. And of course, our business had already started. So I think Sam was 2 when we started the business, so she came to us in 2003. What did I say before? Yeah, 2003 was when we adopted her. So the business was about 4 years old at that point. So, of course, I had to design a group of Chinese themed fabrics about little girls. This was a quilt that was in a magazine again. And also there was the koi fish that I showed you earlier and the yin and yang cats. So those were two quilts that were in two different magazines. And I also did a really fun project with Sakwa. This is just when digital printing was starting, and I convinced Andover Fabrics to produce a collection that I was going to curate. So we basically had a contest for Sakwa artists to submit abstract artwork that would be put into repeat and made into a fabric collection. So these are some of the fabrics that were made from, I think there were 8 or 9 fabrics that we ended up choosing that we felt could be successfully translated into repeating fabrics. I also during this time, I went to China with McCall's Quilting with Beth Hayes and Kay England, and I took a side trip to a really special orphanage for children who were receiving surgery and medical care in Beijing. So these babies and little kids would come into Beijing to receive medical care and then to recover from their surgeries. And on the right, this is a photo from an exhibit that I went to, this incredible artist in Beijing. And as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in portraiture, so this artist really spoke to me. And there's our group. We went to visit a children's special art school, and you can see on the left the kids were outdoors painting, and we also visited indoors in the school where the kids were practicing ink brush calligraphy. So I was very impressed that they had special schools for children to learn art. So I was a Bernina fashion show designer for 3 different shows. The very first year, this was like a miracle. My garment ended up on the cover of the show book. That was on the left. So that's how I became a Bernina ambassador, as I took the show book and I marched into the Bernina stand at Quilt Festival and I said, I would like to be a Bernina ambassador. And they said, oh, great. Uh, the one on the right is the second garment that I made, and that's when I actually got a Bernina machine. And here are some pictures of that on the runway. And then finally, the show ended in 2008, which was very sad, but I did participate in that one also. And these are all one-of-a-kind creations that were draped on a professional dress form. And this is the garment, the ensemble. I don't know if you've heard about this, but back in the legendary mists of time, there was a group of us, a large group of us who were invited to go to Switzerland to the Bernina factory. And we visited the home of the owner, H.P. Ulci. And now actually he's retired and his son, maybe his daughter, are running the company now. But there are 85 of us who they brought to Switzerland. That was quite an amazing trip. And you can see that is, yes, a giant sewing machine in front of the factory. And there's the owner. I think he was the third generation, and now the fourth generation is running the company. I was also in the color marketing group for 15 years. I've always been interested in color trends, in design trends. And because of this, well, how can I explain? As soon as I joined the group, I found that I was one of the more forward color thinkers because there are people who in that group who are maybe not wanting to think so forward. They're making different shades of beige carpet and they're doing paint and curtains and oh gosh, I met the person who was picking the color for the arm of the first class chair for United Airlines and things like that. People who were picking upholstery colors for Toyota interiors. So there are all different kinds of designers who were working with color trends. And I always tended to want to really go forward and talk about color, fashion color trends. Um, I did stay on that group for 15 years. It was very interesting. I was a chairholder and a facilitator. During that period of time, I was also the keynote color trend speaker at the International Textile Show in Las Vegas. And so that's less a part of my annual schedule these days, but this is what it looked like when I would go to those groups. And this is one of the people who I met. And again, talk about a mentor, the very first time that I went to the color marketing group. And so these are people who are picking like the new colors for paint companies, for car companies, and so on. I met Lee Eisman, and so she was the person who was choosing and announcing the Pantone Color of the Year. I haven't seen her for a few years, and I suspect that she is retired or mostly retired, but she's written several really excellent books on color. And if you'd like to pick up just some reference books on color, I would look up her name is actually Leatrice. You can see down the bottom left there, the spelling of her name, Leatrice Eisman. Very interesting person, travels all over the world talking about color. During that period of time, I was asked to come and be the keynote speaker for the color marketing group in Bangkok in 2012. And so I'll talk about our charity program here. My mom and my mother-in-law were both breast cancer survivors, and that's a picture of my mom on the right here. I lost my mom a little over a year ago. But this was, again, that collection I mentioned earlier, where 25 cents per yard was donated to breast cancer research, and we raised over $25,000 through Kauffman. That was donated by Kauffman. We've also donated to Doctors Without Borders, and I continue to give to them. I think it's a really important group, and I've met people who have worked on the ground out in the refugee camps and in war zones with Doctors Without Borders, and I'm just grateful that there are people who are willing to do that work. One of the special recipients of our charity program has been Engineers Without Borders, and I met them through NASA. And so one of the projects that we did was after the big earthquake in Nepal, we had student volunteers who carried donated quilts in their backpacks up little mountain trails to villages that had been destroyed, and there was no way to get there by car. And they presented those quilts to mothers who had babies in the last 6 months. So all the babies were infants. And when you get involved with doing charity work, you can meet some amazing people. These are some of the amazing people I've met. I've been lucky enough to meet and more than just meet, but get to know three different astronauts. On the left here, you might recognize Pam Holland, who's a amazing creative Australian artist. But standing next to her, that tall, handsome man, Victor, is going to be the first black man to go on a space mission to the moon. He's going to be in the Artemis mission sometime in the near future, supposedly, unless it gets canceled. We'll see what happens. On the right, the top right is Ron Garan, and he was up in the space station, I think, twice, and he was up there with Karen Nyberg, who you probably recognize that name. Um, and then here are a couple of other of my friends and contacts in Engineers Without Borders. And my other great partner is Kathy Price in Mission of Love. And mostly with her, we've collected and distributed over 20,000 donated charity quilts over the years. Right now, we're directing quilts to the hurricane survivors in North Carolina, and we're just starting to look at what is going to happen in Southern California following the fires. But of course, the fires are still burning there, so we first have to get those people housed and fed into safety before we can talk about that. But this guy on the right in this photo was a fireman who had lost his house in a fire here in Colorado. And he was moved to tears when he was presented with a quilt. He was really of the mind that he was a person who was in service. He didn't think that he deserved to receive a quilt. And we were really very honored to be able to give that to him. We also worked after the large earthquake and tsunami in Japan with Mission of Love and with, I think it was United Airlines. There was a whole group of people and companies that came together to distribute over 3,000 quilts in Japan to a community that had been just completely obliterated on the shore. And sadly, several years ago, we had a mass shooting here in Boulder, Colorado, at the King Soopers in Boulder, which is our grocery store chain. And we were able to go to a first responder organization or event, I should say. And you can see some of the kids of families who lost their homes, who received quilts, and also the first responders there. I'm sorry, the kids lost a family member, and the folks on the right were the first responders. Because of our charity work, I've been able to meet some amazing people, including Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter. We worked with the Wild Foundation, who hosts the World Wilderness Congress. And this is the group of charities that we've worked with. And I continue to have opportunities to collaborate with these nonprofits, has led to opportunities to speak to give lectures and presentations and also to show my artwork. I'm really committed to being an activist artist. This piece is hanging in the U.S. Institute of Peace, a quilt made from this collection. Oh, here's just a picture of my family, some older pictures, some little bit more recent pictures. All the kids grew up in the business. They all worked here in the warehouse and a little bit in the office. Sophie worked here as an assistant buyer during the pandemic. You may have seen me on Quilting Arts TV over the years, first with Pokey Bolton. You can see our daughter Sophie was also a guest a few times. And I do have all the clips of these Quilting Arts TV segments on our website if you're interested. This is with Susan Brubaker-Knapp, who's the current host. Did a few on fresh quilting, which unfortunately has come to an end, but Heather was the host of that. These are all PBS TV shows. And then most recently, Quilting Arts TV had me back a couple years ago to talk about the topic of art and activism. And the art and activism has taken me around the world, and I've met lots of amazing people. These are just some of the folks in Italy. I was invited to speak in Moscow about 10 years ago and had a private tour of the Textile Academy Museum in Moscow. I'm just going to flip through these kind of quickly because we're running out of time, but I'll just say a quick word about these, and you can always follow up on my video page and on my photo pages. I took a cleft palate surgery trip to Guatemala with Mission of Love and Kathy Price. This was at an orphanage where we gave each of the orphans a quilt. Uh, my first really big activist quilt was in the United Nations in Geneva in the Water is Life exhibit. There's where I met Karen Nyberg when one of my pieces was showing at the NASA Visitor Center. Here's my portrait of Rosalind Carter, which is hanging at the Carter Center now. This is a piece that I made that was traveling in the Endangered Species Project for 5 years. This is traveling right now in the Washington, D.C. exhibit, the White House, and the Folger Shakespeare Reading Room. And this is a challenge contest and exhibit that I curated called Love Your Mother. This is a fabric panel that I designed for the challenge. I also curated for the Love of Gaia, which started out as the pandemic was starting at the International Quilt Museum and then traveled to Birmingham and the New England Quilt Museum. And just before the pandemic started, we managed to move into our new building. Here's some of our staff on the front of our building. Here's that bear that was my model for that endangered species quilt. I've been up to photograph the polar bears 6 times, and they're great. It's a great inspiration for me as an artist. And also I've gone to photograph the brown bears up in Alaska. And you can see all these photos on my Flickr page if you search for Luana Rubin on Flickr.com. I've painted bears in outdoor exhibits. I had a piece that was in the Women's Voices exhibit at the Clinton Presidential Library, and then it went to Houston, and detail of my quilt was on the cover of the show book, which is pretty exciting. And here's my quilt of Hillary Clinton next to the pink suit that she was wearing when she made that famous speech, "Women's rights are human rights." And recently, in the Colorado edition of Quilt Folk, and also on the cover of Patchwork Professional in Germany, my work has been featured. This is a piece that was sold in a fundraiser auction for SAQA last year. This piece is just coming home. It was at the DAR Museum in Washington, D.C. last year. This is traveling in the SAQA camouflage exhibit. Some of you may have seen it in Houston. last fall, and a detail of this quilt is also on the cover of the show book. This piece is traveling with sacred threads for 3 years. It's called The Children of War, and it's obviously on the topic of the children who have been affected by these terrible ongoing wars. Hopefully, they'll be coming to an end soon. I led a textile and costume tour in Italy last month, and this was the day that we rented costumes from a atelier who designs and makes costumes for the film and stage industry. That's me on the far right. And if you follow me on Facebook, this image is also at the top of my personal Facebook page. So I'm having a solo gallery at the Kyoto Quilt Festival in about 5 weeks. And this is an unfinished process photo, but I thought you'd get a kick seeing a piece that I'm working on right now for that Kyoto Festival. It's a tribute to Ichiku Kubota, who you may be familiar, has the museum up on the hill with all of the kimonos that are inspired by the passing of the seasons. This is a piece that is in a show that's coming out later this year. There's a detail. And this is made for a semi-quintennial show for the Virginia Quilt Museum. This is about the enslaved people of Mount Vernon. And this piece is about, did you read that book, Misty of Chincoteague? This is about the ponies that live on Assateague. And I just have to say that the very best thing about being part of our wonderful world of quilting is the people. I love going to quilt events. These are just pictures of many of the people that I saw while I was in Houston this year. I'm sure you'll recognize some of these faces. And if I ever run into you at a show, or if you run into me, please come up and say hello. I'm very open. I'm a hugger, and I just love to meet fellow quilters and celebrate our joy and our creative passion together. This is what my artist website homepage looks like. So if you go to luanarubin.com, this is what you'll see. If you go to my company, oh, this is my Flickr page. If you go to Flickr.com and search for me, this is what you will see. I think I have 15,000 photos over 20 years here. And if you go to Equilter, this is what you will see. This is my company that sells fabric and quilting supplies online. And here's hoping for a better world. And together, I know that quilters can figure out how to make that happen. You might want to take a screenshot of this or just take a quick snapshot. These are some of the pages that I've mentioned. My photo page, the eQuilter blog, video page, and my artist website.